On the day of my father's funeral, my brother looked at me and said, "You missed the service. You missed your last chance. You don't get to call yourself family anymore." I had arrived 4 minutes late. 4. The priest hadn't even finished adjusting the microphone. But it didn't matter. In their eyes, I had broken some sacred, invisible rule that they never let me forget. In this family, your worth wasn't measured in love. It was measured in timing, appearances, impressions, and I had apparently failed again. That day was supposed to be about my father, but somehow it became about me, about how I was always a little late, a little distant, a little too quiet, a little too different. They didn't say it all at once, but in 100 cuts over the years. You're always running behind. You missed Mom's birthday dinner. You weren't there when we sold the lake house. You didn't speak up when Dad got sick. What they never said out loud but always meant was this: you're not really one of us. At the last family meeting, a gathering to discuss the remaining terms of the trust, the tone hadn't changed. I walked into the room, slightly out of breath from traffic, and instantly felt the chill. My sister-in-law raised an eyebrow. "Oh, he made it. Alert the media." My aunt didn't even look up from her notes. And my brother, the oldest, the golden child, leaned back in his chair with that same smugness I'd seen since childhood. "Well," he said, "let's at least try to start on time today. Some of us have jobs." I looked at the clock on the wall. 9:04. The meeting was set for 9 o'clock. 4 minutes. Again, that number had become a curse, a silent condemnation. No one asked why I was late. That I'd stopped for flowers to leave at Dad's grave. That I hadn't slept, reviewing documents they probably hadn't even opened. That I was trying to do things right. Maybe not perfectly, but with heart. But heart didn't count in this family. Only punctuality, power, and appearances. They continued without me, as always, talking over each other, assigning roles, deciding who would get what. Shares, properties, sentimental things that meant less to them than the control they carried. And me? They hadn't even saved me a seat at the table. There was a folding chair in the corner next to the water cooler. I took it, not because I had no pride, but because I had a plan. One they would never see coming. They thought I was always late. But this time, I had arrived early. Friends, let me take a short pause. Would you mind sharing in the comments? Where are you listening from? Have you ever felt like the outsider in your own family? Like no matter what you did, it was never enough? If this story speaks to you, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need to hear it too. That's how you help us grow this channel and keep telling stories that truly matter. Now, let's continue. He was always the little brother, not just in age, but in how they saw him. The one whose ideas were cute. The one whose voice was never quite loud enough to command attention. The one they remembered for dropping the cake at Grandma's birthday, but not for paying her hospital bills when no one else stepped in. It started early. Family decisions were always made in the living room, around the big oak table. His seat was never really at it. He was asked to pour drinks, to bring napkins, to watch the younger cousins so the adults could talk, even when he was already in his 30s. When he spoke, they nodded politely, and then moved on, as if he hadn't said anything at all. Even when he became the first in the family to graduate with honors. Even when he built a company from scratch. Not a flashy one, but one that paid for their emergency repairs, their tax mistakes, their quiet failures they never admitted out loud. He helped in silence. He paid a nephew's tuition without ever taking credit. He co-signed a mortgage when his brother's credit couldn't. He sent anonymous wire transfers when the medical bills started piling up. And they never thanked him. Not because they didn't know, but because to thank him would be to admit he was more than the little one. And that in their hierarchy was dangerous. He was the background, the filler, the one you invite out of obligation but never ask for advice. Not when it counted, even when their father was dying. It was the same. He was asked to give rides and bring soup, while the real discussions about the will happened between his older siblings, behind closed doors. They told him just enough to keep him quiet, not enough to let him matter. They believed he didn't notice, but he did, every time. He noticed how they never asked what he thought, how they interrupted him mid-sentence, how they spoke about him in the third person, even when he was in the room. He noticed how his kindness was seen as weakness, how his patience became invisibility, how his silence was mistaken for stupidity. But they never noticed him, and that was the mistake, because those who stay quiet the longest often carry the sharpest clarity. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want to embarrass them. But he was done playing the role they wrote for him. He wasn't the little brother anymore. He was the one who had read the documents. The one who listened to what their father truly wanted. The one who, despite everything, still believed in doing the right thing, but not at the cost of his own dignity. And now, for the first time, he wasn't waiting for permission to speak. He was preparing to be heard. It arrived not with warmth, but with formality. An envelope that looked more like a parking ticket than a family message. Cream-colored paper, elegant font, his name spelled correctly but coldly. No greeting, no signature, just instructions. Final discussion regarding the distribution of the remaining family trust. Location Wilbur and Finch, LLP. Time 9 a.m. sharp. Please do not be late, as you were during the memorial. That last sentence didn't even try to hide the sting. It wasn't a reminder. It was a warning. He read it once, then again, and for a moment he stood there in the hallway of his apartment, envelope in one hand, the other on the doorknob, as if the weight of those typed words could actually knock the air from his chest. They had always punished him with politeness, with carefully chosen words that looked harmless but bled quietly. Please do not be late. As though punctuality was the measure of love. As though showing up 4 minutes after the scheduled time was a moral failure, while years of neglect and pride were somehow forgiven with a firm handshake and pressed shirts. He thought about that morning, the memorial, how he'd gotten stuck in traffic after stopping by their father's grave, alone, because no one had invited him to the private moment they shared before the service. How he arrived, clutching his father's cufflinks in his coat pocket, intending to offer them to his brother as a gesture of unity. But by the time he stepped into the hall, the mood had already calcified. Late again. Why are we surprised? I guess traffic only applies to him. He had smiled, sat in the back, clutched the cufflinks a little tighter, said nothing. Now this letter, this sterile printed letter, was just more of the same. They didn't ask, "Can you make it?" They didn't say, "Let's talk." They just gave a time, a place, and a not-so-subtle reminder of his place in the pecking order. But what they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that he had already spoken to their father's attorney months ago, not to scheme, but to understand what the trust actually was, what it meant, and what his father had really intended. Because their father wasn't a man of theatrics. He didn't value money the way his children did. He valued effort, loyalty, quiet sacrifice. And maybe that's why he had written that other letter, the one they didn't know existed. The one that didn't come with elegant fonts and legal stamps. The one written in shaky, familiar handwriting, sealed in a plain envelope, waiting in a drawer for the right time. This time, he folded the invitation carefully and placed it beside the other documents. Then he checked his watch. He had 7 days. 7 days to prepare for the moment they thought they controlled. 7 days to let them believe he was still the same. Slow, small, and forgettable. But not this time. This time he wouldn't be late. In fact, he'd be early. Ready, prepared, and no longer afraid of the seat in the corner. Because when truth walks in early, entitlement runs out of excuses. The night before the meeting, he sat alone at his kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. A single lamp burned in the corner, casting a warm but fragile circle of light over the worn surface of the table. The same table where he once helped his father organize bills, write letters, plan renovations no one ever noticed. The papers were laid out neatly before him. Legal documents, trust agreements, scanned bank transfers. All pieces of a puzzle that had taken him months to understand, not because they were complex, but because they were deliberately kept out of his reach, not by law, by family. They never thought he'd look this deeply. They never imagined he'd care. But here he was, not for revenge, not for drama, but because something in his father's handwriting wouldn't leave him. A letter, folded into quarters, yellowing slightly at the edges, handwritten, with pauses and crossings out, not because of age, but because his father had always been more comfortable with tools than with words. He unfolded it carefully. You're the only one who never asked, never begged, never demanded. You helped me because you wanted to, not because you expected anything in return, and that's why you deserve more. Not because you're better, but because you were present when I was sick, when I was lonely, when I felt like the noise of the others drowned everything. You stayed. He stopped reading for a moment, swallowing down the lump that had built in his throat. His father's voice, quiet, steady, rarely emotional, somehow rang loudest in these clumsy lines. This letter wasn't about guilt. It was about recognition, quiet, unpublic, private, but real. No one else knew it existed. Not his brother, who always boasted about being their father's right hand. Not his sister, who handled all the appearances. They had the spotlight, but he had this. He gently returned the letter to its envelope and placed it next to the trust amendment, the one legally signed and notarized, the one that gave him full discretionary power over the final portion of the estate. They thought tomorrow's meeting was just a formality, that they would decide who gets what, that he, as usual, would nod along. But they didn't know the table had already shifted, that the father they thought they understood had made a different choice. He looked around the room, at the quiet walls, at the old photo on the shelf, his father holding him as a boy, both of them covered in sawdust and sunlight. This wasn't about money. It never was. It was about being seen, being trusted, being remembered not as the brother who came late, but as the son who always showed up, even when no one was watching. And tomorrow they'd learn what he had known all along, that sometimes the one they overlook is the one holding everything. He arrived an hour early, not because he feared traffic, not because he wanted to impress, but because he needed the silence before the storm. The office building loomed in front of him, glass panels reflecting a sky not yet ready to open, as if the day itself held its breath. The parking lot was still, vacant, clean, almost sacred in its emptiness. He pulled into the farthest corner, turned off the engine, kept the key in his hand. For a while he didn't move, just sat there, watching his reflection in the rearview mirror, noticing the gray at his temples, the slight wear in his jacket, the way his hands, those quiet, capable hands, rested calmly on the steering wheel. No tremble, no doubt. He had every document in order, the envelope from his father, the notarized confirmation, the legal letter the others hadn't even read properly. But more than that, he had truth. And time. Time they never gave him when he spoke. Time they always measured by how fast he responded to their needs, not by how long he stood by them when they failed. One by one the cars began to arrive. First his sister, perfectly dressed, sunglasses on, already speaking into her phone before she'd fully stepped out of her SUV. Then his brother, late as usual, of course, but no one would mention that. Not to him, not to the pillar of the family. His tie was askew, his walk hurried, but when he caught sight of his younger sibling's car, he smirked, the same old smirk, the one that said, "You'll always be behind me." Next came two uncles, a cousin who worked in finance now, and the family's legal liaison, a friend of their father's who never really liked him, but liked being important. They spoke in hushed tones at the building's front steps, probably already divvying up assets in their minds. No one looked toward his car. No one wondered why he was there already. Of course they didn't. In their eyes, he was just the quiet one, the add-on, the filler. They didn't see the folders in the passenger seat. They didn't see the fire, quiet but alive behind his calm expression. He glanced at the clock. 8:42 a.m. Still time. Still space to breathe. He let his eyes drift across the parking lot, remembering how many times he had pulled into places like this, always behind, always apologizing for things no one else had to explain. How many meetings he'd walked into knowing decisions were already made. How many rooms he had stood in without truly being in them. But not today. Today he wasn't the one catching up. Today he was already here, already grounded, already chosen, not by them, but by the man they had come to honor, and whom they'd long stopped listening to. He reached into the glove compartment, took out the envelope with his father's handwriting, the real centerpiece of today's meeting, and placed it gently in his jacket pocket. Then he opened the car door, slowly, not to rush, but to rise. Because the people stepping out of their cars, they thought he was the background. But today, he was the stage. The conference room was too bright. Fluorescent lights overhead, beige walls, polished table too long for warmth. The kind of room built for transactions, not tenderness. No one rose when he entered. He stepped through the door quietly, though not timidly, holding his leather folder under his arm, his father's letter inside like a steady heartbeat. He had come early, deliberately, with preparation, but it didn't matter, not to them. The roles in this play had already been cast long ago, and his, they believed, was still the same. His aunt didn't even look up. Her glasses sat low on her nose, eyes scanning a printed spreadsheet. She clicked her pen once, then again, as if that sound mattered more than his arrival. To her, he was late to life itself, always behind in something. Not assertive enough, not charming enough, too quiet, too careful. Then came the voice he had expected, the usual one. The one that always carried laughter with a blade inside. "Well," his brother said, glancing at the watch he wore like a trophy. "Would you look at that?" He made it before the coffee went cold. A few chuckles. Thin, short. Enough to wound, not entertain. He didn't respond. Just nodded slightly and pulled out the chair at the far end of the table. Not the corner this time. Not the extra seat near the wall. The end. A deliberate choice. One of only two heads of the table. His brother watched him sit there with mild confusion, maybe irritation, maybe fear. But no one said a word. Not yet. Instead, they went back to pretending. The lawyer shuffled his papers, cleared his throat. Someone poured water into plastic cups. Chairs creaked. Pages turned. Tension filled the spaces where kindness should have lived. They moved on as if his presence was furniture. He looked around, each face so familiar and yet so far. This was the family that once sat around a barbecue in his father's backyard, arguing over music and laughing about burnt burgers. The family he'd helped move when they bought their third homes. The family whose kids he had picked up from school when their parents were too busy. The family he loved, even when they didn't return it fully. But love doesn't always echo. Sometimes it's just thrown into the dark and swallowed whole. He watched them as they reviewed documents they barely understood, speaking in terms they only half grasped, making assumptions based on tradition and entitlement. And none of them noticed the quiet storm sitting across from them. He wasn't angry, not yet. But beneath the stillness, beneath the silence, something had shifted. He was no longer waiting to be invited in, no longer asking to be heard. He didn't need their attention to matter. He had something greater than validation. He had truth and time. And, tucked into the inside of his coat, a letter that would rearrange the weight of every chair in that room. But for now he waited. Because power, when patient, speaks loudest. It was subtle, almost. There were 12 chairs around the long mahogany table. 11 of them lined up perfectly along the edges, polished, straight-backed, evenly spaced. One chair, his, stood apart. Tucked near the corner, half turned toward the wall, beside the humming coffee machine and a folding tray of store-bought pastries. A chair of convenience, not intention. Not near the family attorney. Not near the family photo. The large framed image of their father in his later years, seated in the garden, proud and weathered, with everyone gathered around him. Everyone but him. That photo was taken when he was out of town, closing a deal that had helped cover the costs of their father's last medical procedures. No one waited. No one asked if he could make it. They simply posed, then sent him a copy, cropped. And now here he was again, present but set apart. He ran his fingers along the back of the chair. Cheap plastic, mismatched, like it had been brought in last minute when someone realized, oh, he's coming too. But he wasn't surprised. It was always like this. Family dinners with one less plate set until he asked. Group vacations where he learned the details after the bookings. Phone calls that only came when something broke, something failed, something needed saving. He took his seat without complaint. The others were already discussing divisions, numbers tossed into the air with the same reverence as grocery lists. His brother talked over the lawyer. His sister interrupted the accountant. Everyone had something to say. Everyone had an agenda. And no one looked at him. Not even once. He sat there, not as a participant, but as an afterthought, as a body to be acknowledged only when signatures were needed. The coffee machine sputtered beside him. A drip, a hiss, a cloud of artificial vanilla. He glanced at the framed photograph again. His father's eyes, frozen in a smile, seemed to look past everyone in the picture, as if searching for something just outside the frame, as if seeing someone who wasn't allowed in. He reached into his jacket pocket and felt the edges of the envelope. The real will, the amendment, the handwritten letter. The only thing in that room that truly held their father's voice. They didn't know. Not yet. Because they had written their story without him. Assigned him his role. The quiet brother, the absent son, the chair in the corner. But every play shifts the moment one character stands. And sometimes the man they tried to place behind the coffee machine is the one who holds the keys to everything they believe is theirs. He didn't rise, not yet. He simply watched. Because sometimes justice doesn't enter through the front door. It waits in the corner, silent, calm, and patient, until it's ready to be undeniable. 60% should go to the primary caretakers, his sister said, flipping her notes dramatically, like she was presenting a case to a jury instead of family. That's how Dad would have wanted it. He lived in my house the last 2 years. He was practically in my guest house before that, his brother chimed in. And don't forget, I paid for the renovations on his bathroom. That wasn't cheap. The lawyer didn't interrupt. He just scribbled something in his notebook, like a schoolteacher letting the louder students argue themselves into exhaustion. Percentages floated through the air like dust. 40-30-20, then 50-25-25, then suggestions of splitting based on who sacrificed the most, who had the most contact, who carried the emotional burden. He said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because he'd already read what they hadn't. They spoke of sacrifice like it was currency. They measured love in spreadsheets. And none of them, not one, mentioned their father's actual words, because none of them had finished reading the will. They skimmed, assumed, handed it to their attorneys, who handed it to their assistants. But he had read every line, twice. Once when he first received the sealed amendment, and again the night before at that kitchen table, the paper trembling slightly in his hands, not from fear but from the quiet magnitude of what it meant. There had been a clause, near the end in smaller print, not hidden, just ignored. A clause that gave discretion to one person, to him. The remainder of my trust shall be managed and distributed according to the full discretion of my youngest son. He has demonstrated through quiet loyalty and presence the values this family was built upon. Let him be the one to choose what matters most. They were so focused on numbers, on who did what, who paid what, who deserved more, that they never noticed the sentence that stripped those arguments of meaning. They didn't know they were no longer deciding. They were asking, and soon they'd realize it. But still he didn't speak. He watched. His brother pulled out an iPad showing charts. See, if we divide it like this, no one gets upset. It's fair. Fair? A word that echoed strangely in the room. Was it fair when he was left off the group messages? Was it fair when he showed up at the hospital only to find decisions already made, again, without him? Was it fair when he was asked to sign paperwork for a father they barely visited, because he was always the one they trusted to handle things quietly? He didn't come for revenge. He didn't come for money. He came because truth had waited long enough in silence. And today it would speak, not in percentages, not in calculations, but in presence, in the unshakable weight of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to reveal. He waited until the numbers lost their meaning, until the room became heavy with self-importance, and the arguments started to loop, circling the same shallow logic, the same tired claims of sacrifice and worth. That's when he reached into his folder. The gesture was slow, deliberate, a rustle of paper, the unzipping of leather, and then silence. In his hand, aged but intact, was the envelope. Thick, cream-colored, edges slightly frayed, but still sealed. On the front, in dark blue ink, unmistakable in its curves and pressure, was the handwriting they all knew too well. To be opened only in the presence of all my children. No salutation, no flourish, just those words, final, direct. At first they didn't notice, until he placed it gently on the center of the table, over their spreadsheets, their tablets, their neat little piles of self-justification. His sister raised an eyebrow. His brother chuckled, leaning back with crossed arms. "What's that, Dad's last Christmas card? Should have mailed it sooner." The others followed with light laughter, unsure, but eager to maintain the illusion that nothing serious could come from the quiet one. He didn't laugh. He simply looked at the lawyer, who froze. The lawyer recognized it, that envelope, that handwriting. And suddenly the room tensed. "What is that?" his sister asked, this time with less amusement. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he slid the envelope forward. The lawyer hesitated, then slowly took it, like it weighed more than paper, like it held something alive. He turned it over. "Still sealed, untouched." A lump formed in the lawyer's throat. "I was told," he said carefully, "that if this letter ever surfaced, and if it was intact, it was to supersede prior discussions. It contains a final addendum, a personal one, not legal, not financial, but binding to intention." "Binding?" his brother echoed, suddenly sitting upright. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means," the lawyer said, clearing his throat, "your father wanted his truth heard, not just his money counted." A silence fell like a curtain. He watched their faces. The shift, the crack in their confidence. Because suddenly, the one who always sat quietly, the one in the wrong chair, at the wrong end of the table, had pulled out something none of them expected. Their father's voice, unfiltered, undeniable. And it wasn't in their possession. It had been trusted to him. The envelope hadn't changed, but they had. In one moment, the ground under them tilted, because secrets don't laugh. They don't argue. They wait. And when the right hands open them, they speak louder than any inheritance. The lawyer's hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. The flap lifted with a quiet sigh, like a breath held too long. He took out a folded letter, written on thick paper that had yellowed at the edges. It had the faint scent of cedar. Their father always did keep his desk drawer lined with old cigar box slats, even after he stopped smoking. The room fell still. He didn't speak yet. He didn't need to. Every head turned toward him, not out of respect, not yet, but because something unfamiliar had entered the room. Uncertainty. He looked down at the letter, then back at the people who had talked so much, so confidently. Then he began to read, slowly, clearly, so no one could pretend not to hear. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And so are the illusions. I know you all came here expecting to divide something. But I didn't build this family just to have it measured in percentages. I watched, for years, who showed up when it wasn't convenient. I saw who demanded and who quietly carried. I saw who asked, "When is the meeting?" And who asked, "How are you feeling today, Dad?" I saw who remembered my birthday and who remembered my appointments. I saw who called to ask, "What do I get?" And I saw the one who once called from a gas station in the rain and asked, "Hey, I'm passing by. Need anything? Milk? Your favorite bread?" That call meant more than any of you ever knew. There was a pause. He looked up. His sister's lips parted slightly, like a protest had formed but hadn't found its strength yet. His brother blinked fast, mouth tight, hand tapping a pen that no longer seemed useful. He continued reading. I know what fairness looks like. It's not always equal. Fairness is recognizing weight, and who helped carry it. So no, the family trust will not be split. It will be entrusted entirely to the one who never asked for it, to the one who just kept showing up. Dad, silence. Then something even heavier, stillness. He folded the letter back slowly as if tucking a soul back into rest. No victory in his expression, no smugness, but just truth, simple, quiet truth. The kind of truth that had no need for debate, because it had already lived, been seen, been earned. He laid the letter down gently in front of them, not like a sword, but like a mirror. And for the first time in a long, long time, no one had anything left to say. No one spoke. Not for 10 seconds, not for 30. Nearly a full minute passed, and still nothing. The kind of silence that doesn't fall, but sinks. Heavy, uneven. Like the air itself became aware that it had witnessed something irreversible. He sat motionless, hands folded before him, while across the table, the others tried to process what had just been read. Not just the words, but what they meant. The lawyer cleared his throat, but even that small sound felt intrusive, like a knock on the door of a room where grief had only just arrived. I can confirm, the lawyer said finally, quietly, that the letter is authentic. His voice was low, almost apologetic, as if he too had underestimated the man in the corner. Your father gave it to me directly, sealed. He told me to hold it until a moment like this. The notary stamp is dated 3 years ago, witnessed, legally valid, and, he turned toward him now, slowly. It overrides all previous instructions related to the trust. The table was suddenly a wall. One side silence, faces pale with disbelief, blinking like they'd woken up in someone else's house. The other side, one man, still, centered, not triumphant, but unmoved. Not above them, but beyond their reach. His sister let out a breath, almost a whisper. He gave you everything? Not a question, not really. More a realization, a collapsing of years of quiet dismissal. Of every holiday where he was last to be served. Of every family vote where his opinion was taken under advisement, then ignored. Of every whisper of he's good at numbers but not at people, or he's sweet but not strong. Now, everything they fought over, presumed over, counted on, was his. The trust, the property, the decisions, the power. His brother leaned forward, a hollow chuckle escaping his lips like air from a deflating balloon. So what? You're just going to keep it all? Still no response, because some moments don't require explanation. Some victories don't need a voice. They are the voice. The lawyer broke the silence again. To be clear, per your father's instructions, full control of the family trust including all financial assets, the foundation, and remaining estate, has been transferred into a private entity. He nodded toward him. He is the sole executor. The words landed like bricks. Even the hum of the coffee machine seemed louder now, the only sound brave enough to continue in a room that had once dismissed him as invisible. But he didn't look for their approval. Not anymore. This was not vengeance. This was balance. Justice that had taken its time and arrived precisely when it meant to. He stood. Not with drama, not for effect. He simply rose, slowly, like a man who had waited long enough to be seen standing in his full height. And in that moment, he wasn't the youngest brother. He wasn't the overlooked seat at the end of the table. He wasn't the late one, the quiet one, the polite one. He was the one their father chose. And now, finally, the room knew it too. His brother stood up so fast the chair behind him scraped the floor, sharp and sudden, like the start of a storm. His jaw clenched, nostrils flared. His hand curled into a fist, then released again, twitching. The flush on his face spread from neck to ears, a deep red that once meant rage was coming, and that everyone should brace for it. But this time, no one ducked. No one moved, because this time the room had changed. He looked across the table at the man he used to call Kid, the one he used to brush off with a pat on the back and a half-listening "sure, sure," the one he used to interrupt mid-sentence, the one who would understand when others were chosen over him. But that man, the quiet one, now stood taller than the storm, and so instead of shouting, he swallowed hard. He didn't say, "This isn't fair." He didn't say, "You tricked us," because deep down, beneath all the pride, he knew this wasn't about trickery. This was about time, catching up to truth. He had always known who made the hospital calls when their father's breathing was shallow, who canceled meetings to drive him to checkups, who remembered what brand of tea he liked, who, when asked to speak at their father's birthday, declined, so their father could speak instead. The younger brother hadn't won today. He had simply been recognized. The older brother's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Just the sound of breath caught in pride. Then quietly he sat back down. No storm, just surrender. But not the kind that begs or bargains, the kind that respects, the kind that takes years to arrive and seconds to change everything. The lawyer watched the exchange without a word. He had seen power shift in rooms before, in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in families, but never like this. Because this shift wasn't loud, it was earned. The silence that followed wasn't cold, it was cleansing, like wind after a downpour, like clarity after noise. His sister reached for her water but didn't drink. His cousin adjusted her papers but didn't speak. And he simply stood, with still hands and steady breath. No need to gloat, no need to press the moment. Because when you've been overlooked long enough, being seen is enough. When you've been spoken over for years, silence becomes the loudest answer. And when you've been dismissed as late, arriving on time, just once, is enough to change a legacy. He sat down at the head of the table, his table now. The lawyer slid the folder toward him, the edges lined with forms, all neatly labeled. Asset lists, transfer authorizations, a signature page. One signature. That was all it would take to shift everything. He could keep it all. No one could challenge him. His father had made that clear. The trust wasn't meant to be divided. It was meant to be honored. But honor, he had learned, wasn't just about receiving. It was about what you do when no one deserves it. And you give anyway. He picked up the pen slowly, the weight of it more symbolic than real. This was the same pen his father used to sign paychecks, donations, birthday cards, and once, the hospital release papers when their mother passed. He remembered that day. He was the only one there. He opened the folder, read every line again, not because he didn't trust it, but because the moment demanded reverence. And then, one by one, he began to write. His brother would receive the lake cabin, not because he earned it, but because he had once dreamed of retiring near the water, and dreams, even bitter ones, deserve space. His sister would keep the summer house furniture. The same house she claimed he never really visited, not knowing he was the one who paid for its roof repairs when no one else stepped forward. The cousin, the one who always acted too busy to call, but never too busy to ask for help, would get a modest stipend. Not out of guilt, not out of weakness, but because sometimes generosity cuts deeper than revenge. He signed each name without flinching, not to please, but to release, and with every stroke of ink he felt something lift. The weight of being overlooked, the ache of being misunderstood, the sting of arriving second to people who'd never run the full race. He left himself the core of it all, The power to continue, to protect the values his father once whispered during late-night walks. Dignity, his father once said, isn't inherited, it's chosen. Every time someone doesn't deserve your grace and you give it anyway. He closed the folder. The lawyer watched him, quietly stunned. This wasn't required, he said, almost in disbelief. He nodded. I know. And that was all. Across the table, no one cheered. No one clapped. But something shifted. Respect doesn't announce itself. It settles. And that day, it settled like dust after a storm. Not because he gave them what they wanted, but because he gave from a place they had never seen before. A place higher than resentment, deeper than pride. He didn't split the trust because he had to. He did it because strength sometimes chooses kindness. And kindness, when unexpected, becomes unforgettable. The meeting was over. The papers were signed. The voices behind him had softened into uncertain goodbyes, lingering glances, a few hesitant nods that almost looked like respect, or perhaps shame. But he didn't wait for closure from them. He walked slowly across the estate, past the garden that had grown wild over the years, past the garage where he used to change the oil in his father's car when no one else offered, past the porch swing that creaked differently now, more from memory than wind. And then he opened the door. The air inside the workshop was still, untouched, dense with dust and scent, that particular blend of oil, wood, and old paper. Nothing had changed. His father's tools still hung in perfect alignment, sharpened, labeled in his exacting handwriting. A half-finished carving sat where it had always been, a small wooden box with an uneven lid and no hinges. His father never did get around to finishing it. And in the far corner the chair, the one with the sunken cushion, the worn leather arms, the small burn mark from the time he dropped a soldering iron in '89. The chair his father always sat in, not just to work, but to think, to rest, to watch, to be. He hesitated before approaching it, not because it scared him, but because it never truly felt empty. Like his father's presence lingered in the creases of the seat, in the way the light hit the corner at that hour of the afternoon. This was the only place his father ever truly let himself grow old. And this was the only place where the younger brother, the quiet one, had ever dared to see him as just a man. Not the legend the others kept quoting, but the human being who carried his own grief in silence. He sat down slowly. Not like someone claiming a throne, but like someone returning to a familiar silence. The cushion gave beneath him with a soft sigh. He let his fingers rest on the arms, the leather cool, familiar. He looked up. On the wall ahead, the portrait. Not grand, not formal, just his father in a flannel shirt, one hand resting on a blueprint, the other holding a coffee mug that said, "Fix it right or don't fix it at all." He stared at the eyes in the painting, eyes that had scolded him for being too soft, eyes that had once welled up when he came back to fix the broken gate at 2 a.m. after a storm, eyes that never said, "I'm proud of you," but always made sure the lights were on when he drove up the hill. And now the eyes that watched in silence one last time. He took a breath, deep, heavy, and said it aloud, quietly but with a weight he had carried for too long. "I didn't miss it, Dad. I wasn't late. I just came when it mattered." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to, because in that room, in that sacred silence, they had already been heard, somewhere in the warmth of the afternoon sun that crept through the slatted blinds. Somewhere in the smell of sawdust and history and hands that never stopped building, there was peace, not the kind given, the kind earned. And the chair? It no longer felt empty. The days after the meeting passed without ceremony. No one called to apologize. No one rushed to mend what pride had broken. But he didn't expect them to. Some things, when shattered long enough, stop echoing. They simply lie there, broken but no longer loud. He spent those days walking through old places, the school his father helped fund, the church where his parents were married, the local shelter where he had anonymously paid for repairs the family claimed they couldn't afford to handle. No one knew. He never told them, not because he was hiding, but because dignity, he'd learned, is quiet by nature. The house was still. The silence had shifted, no longer heavy. Now it felt earned. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. Handwritten. The envelope soft from the touch of small fingers that had held it too tightly, maybe nervously, maybe with hope. It was from his niece, the daughter of the brother who once scoffed at him from across the boardroom. Inside, just a few words. You're the only one who never made me feel small. The only one who never laughed when I said I wanted to build things, too. Can I come visit you just for the weekend? I want to see your workshop and maybe learn? Love, Ellie. He read it twice, then once more slower. And something inside him, something long locked away behind years of being the forgotten seat at the table. The afterthought, oh right, you're here too. That something opened. Not with tears. Not with pride. But with the rare, deep warmth that only comes when you realize someone saw you. Not for what you inherited. Not for what you controlled. But for what you never stopped being, even when no one looked. Respect. That was the real inheritance. Not the properties. Not the accounts. Not the signatures or contracts or cold marble tables in cold conference rooms. But the look in a young girl's eyes when she finally sees that kindness and strength can live in the same hands. He went to the kitchen, poured 2 cups of tea, set one across from him, where she'd sit in just a few days. And then he took a pen. On a small card he wrote only this: "Come home any time. I'll keep the chair warm." Outside, the wind rustled the garden his father once planted. Inside, the man once called late sat calmly. Right on time.